to Rebbe's mother Yortzeit.
No, that was a few days ago. But first of all, good morning, friends. It is Erev Shabbos, Friday, December 31st, whatever that means. It is the 27th of Tevis, which means that tomorrow is Shabbos Mevarchim, and it's also when the fiscal year 2021 comes to a close. It's always a question in the Torah world, if you will, how exactly to relate to New Year's, especially on one hand, although of course we relate to it in entirely a secular sense, but there, at least in its genesis and its origin, has a connection to not Jewish passages of time and non-Jewish dates that were certainly once upon a time quite religious in nature. And so I'm not qualified to weigh in on the whole subject, but I know famously this goes around a lot. But Sidney Hecht, who actually I'm friends with his son, Rabbi Shia, so he had Coney Island, Judea. He unfortunately passed away with COVID this year or two ago. But he was once seeing the Lubavitcher Rebbe. His family, the Hecht family, was a big Chabad family. I think he was a little bit more, I don't want to use this word, the mainstream, or he was a little bit more, he was more a Flatbush, Coney Island style Yid than a Chabad style Yid, which is fine and good. He was also very close to the Rebbe because the family had a very close connection. And I think the Rebbe once wished him Happy New Year's, or tells him Happy New Year's, and he looks all shocked. And the Rebbe quoted a pasuk that says Hashem counts. There is significance. If the nations of the world have a certain minyan and a certain date that they restart, so there's some chashivas to it. There's something to it. And so, anyways, certainly for our accounting purposes and other fiscal purposes and whatever. So the main thing is that we daven that as the world marks the passage of another year, let's daven that Hashem send health and happiness and koyach to continue studying the Gemara, and to say, when we make a siyum, which we're not making a siyum on the whole Masechta, so there's a tefillah that we say, there's a prayer that we say, we talk about the difference between a person that Torah is a central place in their life and a person, and well, it's described as a person that doesn't have the gift of Torah. If a person is, and so one of the things we say is Ano mashkim and vehe mashkim. Everyone gets up, but what are you getting up for? Ano ratzim vehe ratzim. Everyone runs, but what are you running to? What is it? What are your values? And so, at a time where people celebrate, it's good to remind ourselves that Yiddishkeit calls us to hopefully live with a higher purpose, higher values, and the details and the implementation, that's the hard work and that's the challenge. But anyway, so it's Dr. Hammer, you're muted.
Historically, isn't tomorrow the day of Yashka's Brit Milah?
Yeah, I believe we say that it might be connected to Yashka's bris. So suffice it to say, the Jews, whatever, Yashka's bris wasn't that, is not exactly something that fills us, sparks joy. So, anyways, but the point is,
it's one day that the whole world celebrates the birth of a Jewish boy in the West Bank.
Right.
Yeah.
My Babbas used to say, "So zan zeir yur and inter git yur."
Yeah. So, anyways, but the point is that alongside this change of our we're gonna have to change. Listen, there's a lot of practical ramifications, and listen, we could daven for the world, we could daven for our friends and neighbors and ourselves for good health and good circumstance. And today we're going to make a siyum on a parak. We're going to conclude a parak of Gemara. So for us, today is a yontif, and you could say l'chaim tonight by the Shabbos meal in celebration of our siyum. So if anyone wants to pop some champagne, we have a good Gemara reason to do so. All right, let's share the screen and get started. And just to remind, we took off on what we might describe as a tangent of sorts, discussing another melacha or another prohibited act that may be a melacha, or maybe it's a tolda, or maybe it's the rabbanon. And of course, we're talking about the being toilish, uprooting a plant, a fruit, or something that's growing, but not on the ground. It's growing in a flower pot, in an earthenware pot, or maybe another kind of pot. And being that it's not attached to the ground, there are strong opinions. There's a strong case to be made that this is not really the conventional melacha of uprooting, of plucking something from the ground, because It's in a flower pot. And if, yes, Dr. Stamler, you brought it up yesterday, and I don't know if we gave it proper attention. I believe a related shaila would become the hydroponic plants that grow entirely removed from the ground. So what is their halacha? And again, I don't have enough information to go into it at length, but suffice it to say, certainly there's a case to be made that it might not be a biblical prohibition, being that it is not attached to the ground. There's a counter argument to say that even if it's not in the ground, there's still some kind of shaykhs. But anyways, it's a very good question, and it's a big shaila, and I'm 99% certain that there are vast discussions on the topic in the poskim, in the shaila to chuvot, in halachic responsa, and particularly because there are other halachic issues besides for Shabbos, Shemitah and the like. And so suffice it to say, it's a big subject worthy of attention, but we're not going to give it the attention it deserves today. But I just wanted to acknowledge and recognize that as we give our preamble over here. So that was the discussion. And from this discussion, the Gemara started saying, hold on. Okay, so a pot that's whole might separate what's inside it from the ground. Well, what if there's a hole that further connects it to the ground? Well, that's not. That also is the subject of a machloikas. If it's a pierced, punctured hole, punctured pot, well, according to the Tanakama, you now be chayiv. According to Rabbi Shimon be pater. And from this, we moved on to a broader discussion about what a hole in a vessel does to it. Does a hole decommission? Does a hole cause a vessel to be considered utterly broken? What do we care if a vessel is considered utterly broken? Well, because there is a halachic, important halachic. It's relevant halachically, because an earthenware vessel, for example, becomes impure. It cannot be toiveled in a mikvah. It cannot be purified, but it can be broken. And upon being broken, when it's halachically considered beyond repair, beyond use, it now becomes tahor again. It becomes pure again. And so our discussion that we started yesterday, we're going to close out today, with Hashem's help, is what degree of damage makes a vessel considered decommissioned, broken, and therefore tahor. And we mentioned Rava, we studied, as Rava lists 5 different degrees of damage, and each one depending on the circumstances, the halachic use, and the intended use. The item may or may not be considered decommissioned. It may or may not become tahor again. So what were those 5 degrees of damage? Let's recap it fast inside, and then we'll move on, and we're going to close out Perek Asiri, the 10th chapter of Masechah Shabbos, and we're going to start with Hashem's help, the 11th chapter, which is called Perek Hazorek, and it's going to describe another dimension of carrying, and it's going to allow us to once again engage and keep our brains fresh, and I think we'll enjoy it. So real fast, there are 5 different measures of what might make a keli considered broken or not a keli. The first is for liquid to flow out, to leak out, which the smallest hole might allow liquid to leak out. And this kind of hole in a shard makes the shard considered useless. Doctor, how are you? So the bags aren't out yet. Did you get guidance how to find them, or do you need my assistance? They're in the refrigerator. Do you have a list, or do you need a list? I'm sorry? Okay, so it's just right in the refrigerator. Don't mind the mess. All right, sorry, folks. Professor, I'm hearing my voice.
Yes, I do.
No, but I want to welcome you, but I'm hearing my voice. I think it's over. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to hit mute, but please don't take that personal, and please unmute yourself, because we like to hear your voice. But all right, shkoyach. 5 measures to consider a keli broken. If water leaks out, well, that would cause a shard to be garbage. But otherwise, the vessel in the Mishnaic era halachically is considered a whole kli. Again, today we probably would be a little bit more discerning. We'd probably be a little more picky, but that is the way it was back then. If it's big and if the hole is large enough that liquid will flow inwards when you place it into a basin or to a tub or to the water, well, now it is disqualified from being used for certain temple rituals. For example, the ritual of the red heifer, but it is still considered a vessel to consider the seeds that are inside of it to not be on the ground. If the whole is, yes, Rebero.
It's very important if we're talking about liquid or water, because there
Correct.
are liquids who are viscous who wouldn't go through, but the water would.
That's a good point. That's a good point. So I believe in the context of our discussion, we're talking about water, but that is a very good point. Not every fluid is equal when it comes to the size of the hole and will it drip, or the extent of how it will leak. That is a fair point.
For example, if you had honey, what's the big deal if there's a small hole?
Yes. Honey is much less likely to drip out than water and other liquids. I believe wine or certain juices are a little thicker than water. And so you're right. There's going to be some variation in those dimensions, but I believe we're discussing here water. Now, if we're talking about a hole that little water could leak in, it still doesn't mean that solids will drip out. But if there's a hole the size of an olive, well, now you're in trouble, says Rava, because now you're going to have a hard time holding small stuff that you usually keep in a basket or in a keli, in a vessel. And therefore, if the hole that it develops in this earthenware dish is so large that an olive will fall through, it is now considered tahar. However, you can repurpose it and reactivate its identity as a kli if you're going to decide you're going to use it for larger fruits. And now it can become tameh again because it's considered a vessel, a keli. But if even a pomegranate will fall through the hole, we're talking about a really devastating large size hole. The vessel is considered entirely, utterly decommissioned, broken, and halachically, it is no longer a vessel. It is a broken shard. But if this vessel, which has a large hole, is entirely surrounded in a seal, well, it could still be considered a keli for one purpose, which is to protect that which is inside of it from being contaminated ritually under certain circumstances. This last one, I want to leave off from going in depth just because it's a whole other topic. But suffice it to say, we have a hole that water leaks out. We have a hole that water leaks in. We have the hole that a little root can go through the hole. We have the hole the size of an olive. We have a hole the size of a pomegranate. And we have a hole that's more than 50% of the actual vessel. Those are different measurements, different dimensions that with each one in the right context makes the vessel, makes the keli considered decommissioned, broken, and no longer ritually impure. That's what Rava taught. And that's that. That was yesterday's Gemara. Let's zip through with your permission. So I want to do a siyum. I want to conclude this parak. We're also going to turn the page with Hashem's help to 96 Tzadik Vav. So on the subject, Amar Ravasi. This is a different opinion. Shamati klicheres shiurei kemoitzi rimoin. I heard my tradition, the teaching that I received was klicheres shiurei. What makes an earthenware vessel decommissioned, broken? Kemoitzi rimoin. If it is the size that a pomegranate falls out. That is the end of the life, the halachic lifespan of a keli. If it has a hole the size of a pomegranate, it is now utterly useless. That's what Rav Asi teaches. It sounds like, simple reading, there is no larger measure. Amalei Rava, so Rava challenges him and says, maybe you didn't hear, but there's actually another use, there's another halachically relevant fact to talk about. Shema loy shamata, ela b'mukif tzmid pasil. Did you hear about, or probably you didn't hear about, the fact that even if it's broken more than a pomegranate, if it's sealed, it could still protect the stuff that's within it from becoming ritually impure under certain circumstances. Or I'm sorry, Shemalei Shamata Ela B'Mukif Samid Pasul. Maybe you only heard that if it's sealed, the pomegranate size hole could break it. But Rava says that the size of the pomegranate hole when it's sealed in is not the problem. It's not the measure. Hold on one second. We'll explain more at length. Like kasha, basically, here's the gist of the question. Is a pomegranate hole the end of the lifespan, or is it possible that there could be a larger hole and it will still have some kind of use in this rare case where it's sealed in? And it sounds like Rav Asi is disagreeing, rejecting, or is not accepting the teaching of Rava that says that a earthenware vessel that is covered with a seal, it prevents ritual impurity from being conveyed to the substance within the vessel. But he says, no, lekasha, it's very simple. A small dish, the hole the size of the pomegranate totally makes it useless. But if you have a large dish, well, then a pomegranate size might not make it entirely not useful and might not utterly shatter its identity. So maybe the distinction between the measurements is not just is not open-ended. Maybe it depends on the size of the vessel you're dealing with.
Why didn't they bring up the issue of a seal when we were discussing the size of a hole, the size of an olive?
Well, Rava does bring it up, but it's really a different matter. It's not so much the question of the status. The first four measures that we talked about are, is this item considered a keli? Does it have the halachic designation of a vessel? The final question, I believe, is less about the designation of the vessel and more about its ability to act as a mechitza, an ability to separate between the stuff inside the vessel and the impurity in the room. So it's not, I believe it's a little bit of a different concept halachically. I'm trying to skim over it because I want to get to the end, and this is like a heavy and quite complicated nuanced subject, which we'll get to. I just don't believe here is the primary site of that discussion. But suffice it to say, I believe there is a conceptual difference, which is why there's an instinct to leave it out of that list. But now we're going to move on to a different discussion, or a slightly different discussion. Now we're going to move on to the discussion of the ability for liquid to drip out or the liquid to come in. Amar Rav Asi. Rav Asi taught as follows. Shoinin. We've been taught. Those who teach the Brises taught as follows. Klei cheres, earthenware vessels. Shiurai. What makes it? What is the measure of a break that causes it to be no longer considered a keli? Kli cheres. What breaks a kli cheres? The koines mashka, when water can seep into it. That's really the important measure. What makes a keli no longer a keli? Sounds like some kind of riddle. When is a vessel not a vessel? But no, when is a vessel halachically decommissioned? So Rav Asi says the measure is when it's a hole large enough for water to seep inwards. The whole discussion about a crack that just allows water to seep out. This is only exclusively regarding a gistra. It is only regarding a shard. What does that mean? As you may recall, we said that a vessel that is made of earthenware, if it becomes ritually impure, it can never be purified in a mikveh. Its purification is only by being broken. Now, let's say you smash the keli. Let's say you smash the earthenware vessel. So can it ever become tameh again? Can it ever become susceptible to ritual impurity? And the answer is yes, you can redesignate this now purified vessel if the broken fragment also has value. It also is useful. The word gistra means the repurposed, the recycled fragment that you're choosing to use and to reintroduce into circulation and to use in your home. We might call a gistra a recycled keli. Today, we might imagine the way we'd reuse a disposable, I don't know, peanut butter canister or whatever. So it's a shard, which essentially the vessel is broken, but now you're reconstituting it. So a repurposed shard, if it has any kind of further hole, is discarded. My time. Why would we discard? Why are we more strict? Why are we more demanding about the standard of a shard than a whole keli? So Amar Marzuch Abrei Rav Nachman, you're not going to say, oh, my shard has a hole, let's patch it up, let's put another shard under it to catch what drips. Instead, you'll say, I'll pick another shard. So when you're using something that's recycled, the moment, and it's of little value, the moment it stops functioning exactly the way you need it, you'll throw it out and you'll take another disposable item. Rashi. So you have a pot, the pot breaks, or the jug breaks. But in a time where there weren't a lot of earthenware vessels, if you tilt it on its side, it can still hold a nice amount of liquid. So you might choose to repurpose it. But if that shard has a hole, you're not now going to try to put something underneath it to catch the drip, and you'll throw it out and you'll go take another shard. Shards are much more affordable, they're much more available, and therefore you're not going to make yourself mishugar. And so for that reason, for a shard to be considered decommissioned once and for all, even a small break, a small crack is sufficient. And that's the point that Rav Asi makes over here. So again, we had 5 different measures. We started off with a small crack, enough just for a little water to leak out. Now we have the context. Usually that kind of crack does not decommission a keli. But if the keli is already on its last leg, that's enough to throw it or push it over the edge and to cause it to be decommissioned. Amar Ula. Ula shared a machlokes. Pligi ba tre amorai b'marava. Again, the Talmud Bavli, the center of its existence, the vantage point of the authors of the Talmud Bavli is in Bavel. So Ula records, and the Gemara recounts that there's a machlokes of the Chachamim in Israel regarding hechsher zroim, regarding what kind of broken keli considers what's in it to be removed from the earth, and what kind of broken keli is considered so utterly broken that whatever is in it is essentially on the ground. Pligi b'trei amarai b'marav. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Avin, Rabbi Yossi bar Zavda, the 2 Rabbi Yossis. Chad Amar Kamaitzi Rima. One says that if a vessel has the hole the size of a pomegranate, now what is inside it is considered not an akili. The other says no, even a small hole the size of a small root already decommissions the keli. V'simonach, how are you going to remember the opinions, the 2 opinions here? There's a verse that says echad hamarba ve'echad hamamet, whether you give a lot, one does a lot and one does a little. Let me just explain briefly here. There's really 3 standard measurements: a root, an olive, and a pomegranate. Those are the 3 mainstream perspectives of what decommissions a vessel. In Israel, the machlokes is, one opinion says the larger measure, a pomegranate, the other says the smaller measure, a root, and they skip over. No one takes the position that the olive size hole is what decommissions a keli. And so therefore there's a famous phrase we say, echad hamarbeh, echad hamamit, and usually we say, va'ikar she'ichav l'shem shamayim, whether a person does a lot or a person does a little, the main thing is that they are doing it with sincerity. But the Gemara uses this as a siman, as a mnemonic, a way to remember that the 2 opinions in the Israel take the 2 extremes, either very large or very small. However, a 3rd opinion, which is the 3rd opinion that we expressed in our Gemara, which is Rav Chinna ben Kana in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, which says that a vessel that has a hole the size of an olive, that's what decommissions a vessel from being tar. Mark Shisha added to this statement. So again, we're talking about earthenware vessels becoming decommissioned, being considered broken and therefore no longer atomic. Rabbi Eliezer says an earthenware vessel, if it has a hole the size of an olive, it's tahar, it's decommissioned. And then Mark Shisha adds the Harehain Kichle Galolim Uchle Avonim Uchle Adama. When a vessel, an earthenware vessel, has a hole this size, it becomes just like a vessel made out of dung or stone or earth, which it is no longer susceptible to ritual impurity at all. Rashi, when it has a hole the size of an olive, even if you decide you're going to use it for a fruit basket, it is still perpetually pure and it cannot become impure. He obviously disagrees with Rava, and he disagrees with some of the earlier opinions asserted. But yet, for the purpose of blocking out ritual impurity of a mess when it's closed in, then it is still a problem until it is broken in its entirety. Hadron Allah Chamatzniya. This concludes our study, our reading, our journey through the 10th chapter of Masechah Shabbos. Every Masechta every chapter usually has a common theme. And I think we can say that this chapter really took us on a tour, covered a wide variety of subjects, honey, sweeping, cheese making, and those are just the most recent topics. Cutting nails or hair, what else? If you carry something in an odd manner, is it considered carrying? If you carry with your left hand, your right hand, on your foot, on your leg, if you recall that. What about shnaim sha'asu, two people who do something jointly? We discussed that at length. We talked about if you did a malacha of ein tzarich legufa, you don't need its primary effect or result, and we discussed all the different opinions of it. Suffice it to say, this was an interesting and somewhat challenging parak in Masechah Shabbos, and in Hadron Allah Chamatzniya, with Hashem's help, we hope to revisit this chapter.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I still have this feeling of what's going on economically. Imagine if somebody came with a shaila or a pot or a shard or whatever, wouldn't the Beis Din take into account that this is a poor person? Because a rich person, a hole, not a hole, big hole, small hole, throw it out. We got plenty. Does that become a factor ever?
Over here, first of all, hold on. Over here, number one, these are standards, halachic standards that are based a little bit on. I don't want to make the claim that it's based on psychology, but it's based on a pragmatic survey of how human beings interacted with their kelim in those days. Now, to say a keli is ritually broken and now pure is a kula, not a chumrah. You want your keli to be tar. So on the contrary, to say it's tar, to say it's broken is actually a leniency. But I'm not convinced that the rabbis. I'm not convinced that a Beis Din would change the halachic status. But I just want to make the case that you actually want to hear that your keli is considered halachically smashed. If it's practically broken. And so at least you should have the halachic flexibility or leeway as a result. So I just want to give a fast recap of today's Gemara. We reviewed the 5 different measures that might make a keli considered ritually impure, and then we reviewed a series. We explained why we have a more exacting standard, and even a smaller crack would make a shard considered entirely decommissioned, because the shard is already less valuable, and so you have less tolerance for malfunction, you have less tolerance for problems. It's like if your plastic cup has a hole, you're not going to think twice, you'll throw it out, even if it's a slice hole, even if it's a little crinkled. It's a plastic cup, it's disposable. The moment it's not useful, you throw it out. Something that's very decorative, and maybe there's a sentimental attachment, you're more inclined to be a little more patient, and so long as it works, mostly you might be inclined to use it or to patch it up. We then mentioned that. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, what would prevent me from taking a cleat, purposely putting a hole in it, sealing it up, and then I don't have to worry whether it's mekabel tuma, I put a kli in it, that's a hole in it, and that's it.
Maybe, I don't know. It's an interesting question. Can you strategically? We could, Dr. Stamler, we could open, and we need Dr. Hammer's permission to go into his industry, but we could open a special service. We have a drill exactly the size to decommission a keli, and we can.
We can sell them and tell the person, don't worry, there's a little
Oh,
yeah,
we could sell a special drill.
a whole business.
That's an interesting shaila. I believe that may be the case. I'll tell you this much. You're allowed to, one of the other options, if a keli becomes impure, you could put it into the kiln and totally recook it. And when it reaches a certain heat, it's considered deconstructed. And then when it hardens, it's considered reconstructed. So you're asking an interesting shaila that I haven't considered. What if you strategically and intentionally make a hole? With that, if you desire to make the hole, to make your keli functional, does that eliminate our ability to say that it is dequalified or decommissioned? That's a very interesting shaila. I hadn't considered it, and I'm sure it is considered. I just didn't consider it. The Rambam. Let's take a look at the Rambam for a moment. Let's see what he says. How big is the break that would consider a earthenware vessel pure? And it would become no longer impure from its impurity. Or that it would no longer be capable, susceptible to ritual impurity. If it's used for foods, the size of an olive. Well, let me ask you this, Dr. Stamler. How useful is your pot going to be if the I don't know, the rice falls through the hole? So we have to
you use it for large beans, for lima beans.
Okay, so let's see. So that's a good question. So you decide to use it for a larger item. So I would think that might be a problem, because our Gemara itself said that you might develop this a hole the size of an olive, but if you decide to use it for a pomegranate, it becomes
Yeah, but you can always seal it
You can
also.
also have the
Also, the
hole on
shaila-
top and not fill that high. And then even the rice won't fall out. You can maneuver around it, no problem.
Yeah. So interesting. So the shaila is, Dr. Stamler, here's really the shaila. Let's say that until now you use this dish for food, for olives. Let's say you actually had olives in it. And you say, this thing became tummy and I need it to be tahar. So I'm going to take my little handy dandy tahar drill. I'm going to drill out a hole the size of an olive. Now, admittedly, I can't use this for olives anymore, but before you drill the hole, you say, I'm going to use it for pomegranates. Does it work? Because you're able to decommission, or recommission, I should say, the keli for pomegranates. So does it work retroactively? I don't know. It's interesting. So let's take a look at the Rambam. Let's see if he gives us any clues about how he passes. So if it's food, if it's a food receptacle, well, if it has a hole the size of an olive, it becomes no longer tamei and it is no longer susceptible to impurity. If it is a vessel meant for liquids, and when it has a hole so large that liquid drips will flow inwards. When you place it into water, the water will seep it. If your keli is used for dry and liquid items, we will lean on, we'll judge it l'chumra. How so? If it has multiple purposes, we will not consider it tahar until it achieves the largest size break. So we'll go l'chumra. When do we talk about a measure of liquid dripping out? Because then the whole purpose of a shard is to catch drippings, and so you're not going to bring a shard for the shard. So the Rambam doesn't give us any clear indication about this.
Rabbi,
Let me see if any of them. Yes.
something else just occurred to me. Most of the damage is a chip to like a plate in the corner. Would that be considered a hole?
I don't believe so. Not in this context. All right, let's take a sneak preview of the next parak. In Jewish style, we always, whenever we accomplish something in Torah, we never really want to rest or stop where we're at. We always want to symbolically continue on to the next subject. Certainly, when you make a siyum or we conclude, we always want to go on to the next thing. But we also have an enduring attachment. Hadron alach. We spent a few months of our lives on almost a daily basis studying Parak Asiri, and this is a moment worthy of celebration and congratulations, because our Chabura is some of the most committed, knowledgeable, scholarly, wise, and insightful folks we could possibly gather. And we also have a dream team here, because with our diverse disciplines, we're able to really cover and consider the topics with a varied series of angles and perspectives. And I really think it makes this something very special and unique. So at this point, I want to say thank you, and Yashikach Rivero.
With Bernie there, I wouldn't use the word committed too often.
I agree. I agree. I'm convinced that you are absolutely correct.
Everyone should be committed. All right. So we are generally in the neighborhood of talking about, discussing carrying. A malacha, a prohibited activity on Shabbos, is the transportation of stuff from one point to the other, or carry a certain distance in the public domain. That is carrying. Haitza'ah, we said, was taking something from point A and getting it to point B. What if, and Mark, if you're on, I hit mute also, you have to unmute again. But Mark, morning.
Morning.
You're in touch with Shalom Bear? You're doing packages?
Yeah.
What at Tzaddik? So you're in touch with Shalom Bear, right?
Yeah.
Okay, shkach. So what happens if, you might think, I can't carry, but what if I throw the item? And again, Mark, we might be having flash.
One rishus yachid to another, and then
Yes.
having to go airspace.
So you might be having flashbacks. To our early days of Masechah Shabbos. And so this is actually the primary chapter that we're going to talk about: throwing, causing an item to go from point A to point B, but not necessarily that you are shepherding it, you're bringing it all the way, but you're using your force to throw it. And so let's see, can you throw something on Shabbos? Maybe that's a good heter. Maybe this helps us avoid carrying. So spoiler alert, no. If you throw something from a private domain to a public domain, you stand indoors, you're standing in the shul, and there's a guy outside, and you want to throw him, I don't know, your keys. So you say, I can't carry it, I can't hand it to him, but what if I throw it? So to throw from the private domain to the public domain, or you throw something from the public domain into the private domain. Chayav, this is prohibited. One may not do so. But what if you want to throw from one private domain to the other private domain? Or and there's a public thoroughfare in between the two. Is that permitted or not? Without getting, the Gemara is going to get a little technical, but before getting technical, what if, and I don't know if all of you know this, but my apartment faces the Taramina. And so what if I want to throw my good friend, Professor Stern, what if I want to throw something to him on Shabbos? I want to send him, I just finished reading a book. It's a great book. It's a great read. And I've been developing my throwing arm, so I could manage to. So could I do that? Well, first of all, Mark is going to chime in, because Mark is also in that same complex. I hope this is not disclosing private information. And it happens to be that in between our building and Mark and the professor's building, there's actually not a public domain. There's a very strongly a private domain. There's actually a roped off space. So it's not a perfect example. But let's say Times Square ran between, or Ocean Drive ran between our apartments. Could I throw it or not? It's starting in a Rishus HaYachid, it's starting in a private domain. It's landing in a private domain. Chayev or pater. Rabbi Akiva says, Mechayev. Rabbi Akiva said, this is a Shabbos desecration on a biblical level. This is a biblical act of carrying. The Chachamim Chachamim. Why, of course?
Because you're doing the intention on Shabbat. You're physically taking your arm and stretching it and doing the malacha.
But really the question is, if I could get an item from point A to point B, point A being a private domain, point B being a private domain, is that permitted or not?
Not permitted, unless you have an Eruv.
Well, first of all, you identify strongly with Rabbi Akiva, which, by the way, Rabbi Akiva is a pretty fine person to identify with. But it's not all that simple. The Chachamim say that you are pater because you're moving an item from one private domain to another. And let's say, for example, if you know the hotels, you have those like doors that you can, if I have one apartment and you have another apartment and we have a common doorway, I would be allowed to send something biblically, at least. Rabbinically, there's an Eruv maybe, but I would biblically be permitted to hand something from my apartment to your apartment. Or let's just use, well, once we've gone there, Professor Stern wants to hand Mark something from one apartment to the other. They're staying in a private domain, that would be allowed. And ostensibly, they would even be allowed to throw it biblically for sure. And so just because they were
rules, if you live in a building, you can carry in a building.
I know I said that we're going to put on the side the rabbinic question of an Eruv. Right now, we're just talking on the biblical level. So hold on one second. So on one hand, just because there's a Rishus HaRabim in the middle in the airspace, but it's starting out in a private domain, it's ending up in a private domain. Rabbi Akiva, however, says what I suspect Eli said, and maybe Dr. Stam was going to say, ultimately, it's going to be passing through a Rishus HaRabim, and you're not allowed to cause something to go from a private domain to a public domain. But there's a problem, because to consider carrying, there needs to be 3 steps. It needs to be picked up, it needs to be moved, and it needs to be placed down. And it never was placed down, maybe, in the public domain, unless you imagine that while it's traveling conceptually, it's on the ground. And so that's going to end up, that's where we're going to get into the complexity of the question. But on the basic level,
the height of the transmission is of importance.
Yes, very much so.
High enough, then the issue is moot.
Yes, so one of the issues that we're going to discuss is height. Yeah, that's an important issue. Let's, Dr. Stamler, I'm sorry, you were saying something and I.
Yeah, no, it's but I think I got my answer, because the question I was going to ask, what if you attach an item to a dog and send him over to the others, Rishut HaYachid? Is that considered carrying? But it depends on the height also, or depends. Was it 3 tfachim, 4 tfachim high?
That's a good question. Can you use
when
a
you're attaching it on Shabbos or before Shabbos? That's a problem.
Yeah, can you use a carrier pigeon?
I'm talking about on Shabbos. Can you attach something and just, you're not doing an active, you open the door and the door runs out and goes, stick out to the other person. Can you do that?
But how's the rope being brought from one end to the other end?
No rope, dog. I said a dog.
The whole thing about what you could put on an animal that would be considered carrying or not. That was a while back.
Yes.
The old days you could put it on a donkey, I guess.
Like certain things you would put on an animal would be carrying, and certain things wouldn't be.
Rebberal? Yeah.
Rabbi, I have a different question. In all the examples, you have a pitcher and a catcher. What if you just throw it, not for anyone to get it?
So I don't think so that's a very good point. I don't think we've mentioned a catcher at all here.
Well, you're saying you throw something to your friend. You throw a key.
What I was giving was an unscientific. It wasn't a precise example. I was just trying to allow us to envision somewhat what's going on. But you're correct. So far, we haven't talked about
just throwing. You're not allowed, whether somebody's there, whether there's a purpose or no purpose.
Well, we're just starting the conversation. So of course, we're going to talk about all of these things. If the person is receiving it, the height, the dynamics. Is there a Carmelis? What if someone catches it? I don't know if we're going to talk about putting it on an animal, but that's a good question. Can you use a carrier pigeon on Shabbos? It starts off in your home. It lands in someone else's home. That's probably not considered zoyrek. There's other issues. We had an argument about using animals. But anyways, we've got many more questions and answers. And as a matter of fact, we haven't even finished the Mishnah. The Mishnah itself is going to give us an example. It's going to try to give us the specifics. And then the Gemara will help us explore that. And so let's continue the Mishnah. And again, this is when we start on Sunday, and I'm going to put a little question mark about Sunday. There's a small chance that we'll have to cancel Sunday again. But when we start on Sunday or Monday, and I'll let you know, we'll reread the Mishnah and then jump into the Gemara, and we'll have a lot more information. Ketzad, help me understand what this looks like. How is this private domain, public domain, private domain situation going? If you have two balconies, each facing each other, and right by a Rishus Rabim, a public domain. So I guess we could imagine two balconies protruding into the public airspace, and in middle, it's a thoroughfare. If you would pass or throw an item from one balcony to the other, potter, you would now be potter. Rashi, Ketzad shtei guzotros, Rabbanan Kamrilu. This is the opinion of the Chachamim. What's gizutros? So funny. Here, Rabbi Steinsaltz and actually the Art Scroll too translate gizutros as a kind of balcony. But literally, it doesn't mean a balcony. It means zizin hayotzim el hakoisel. It's like a protruding beam. Umanichin aleim nesarim lahalech. And they would place, it would be a protruding beam, and they put some cross planks so that you could use this protruding space. Zu keneged zu, v'shnei tzidei rishus harabim, v'hein rishus hayachet shegvoim yud rechav istal. The reason why these are considered in general a private domain is because it has a height of 10 tvachim and it has a certain space. Potter. So again, the Mishnah here is now explaining why the Chachamim say potter. So if you have two balconies sticking out, and in between them is a Rishus Rabim, if you carry, if you pass, if you throw, potter. But if they were both on the same level as one another, and they run across the Rishus Rabim, let's just read the words, then we'll Hamoishet Chayev Azer Potter. If you pass something, you're Chayev. If you throw it, you're Potter. Shekach Haisa Avaidas Halavim, because it was a Mishkan fact. In the Mishkan, they did pass things to one another. But hold on, let's back up for a moment. We got a lot of Rashis to do. Potter. Why would you be Potter if you have two balconies opposite one another, facing one another with the Rishus Rabim middle? Why would you be Potter? We do not have the existence of throwing or passing in the construction of the Mishkan or in the work of the Mishkan. There is no instance in the administration or construction of the Mishkan where you passed something from one private domain to another private domain through a public domain. Because the Levites were never entrusted, were never given the task of passing an item from one wagon into another wagon. And remember, the whole Rishus HaYachid, Rishus HaRabim dynamic, which I probably should have introduced in the beginning of our conversation, would be moving something from a wagon to the Mishkan plaza. And that was very prevalent. The Levites carried stuff on the wagons and they offloaded those items into the public domain. Again, Rashi. The Levites did not have a task to pass the beams of the Mishkan from one wagon to another. Elo le'agola shelefoneha. Oh, not from side to side. Elo le'agola shelefoneha. Vishlachra. They only passed it perhaps from one to the next, but not across. This Rashi needs some work. Sha'arba agolei soyu livnei merari. Now Rashi gets into the weeds. Let's think about it. We know the Levites, each Levite family had their own job in the Mishkan. In the family of Merari, Kahas carried everything by hand. Gershon, I believe, carried some of the other vessels, and Merari carried the frame and the beams. Livnei Merari had 4 wagons. Shayunoisim Karsha Mishkan, and they would carry the beams of the Mishkan. Excuse me. And the wagons would move in a kind of formation, one next to the other. When they would deconstruct the Mishkan, litoin ala hagoles, and they would place the beams onto the wagons. They would align them one in front of the other. And they would be parked across the Rosh Hashanah because they wanted to follow the pillar of cloud. And they would pass the segments, the parts of the Mishkan to the wagon that was nearest to it. And then they would pass it forward. So they would pass something. This is it's not complicated, but basically imagine 2 vehicles parked one in front of the other. So the 2 wagons were parked one in front of the other. And it was possible that they would move something directly from one to the next. But the 2 that were parked on 2 sides of the street, so to speak, so they would move items. If you give me 1 minute, I'm finishing a Gemara Shemir. They would move it from one wagon to the one in front of it, not from one wagon to the side of it. On Sunday, we'll break it down on Bli Neder. I'll try to find some pictures so we can visualize what it looked like. But in short, there was a scenario where they passed an item from one private domain to the other. There was another kind of passing from one domain to another that did not happen. And based on the way the wagons were aligned in the Mishkan determines, according to the Chachamim, a scenario where one may and a scenario where one may not pass from one private domain to the other. I'm sorry to leave us in a little bit of a mess, but I hope we have at least the general gist of things, and which is, again, the Chachamim say 2 items, 2 balconies across one another, you could pass because you never pass like that in the Mishkan. But if their 2 balconies are alongside one another, that would be prohibited because indeed, explains Rashi, they would pass from one wagon to the other in such a manner. And that's what the Mishnah means. And then the Mishnah explains. Yes.
I'm going to send you, I have to find it on my phone. I had the whole map of Eruvin, about the dialogues and everything. I'm going to find it and send it to you.
Yeah, send it to me. We could share it on the screen. But Bli Neder, we're not that complicated. Hold on, but Eli, we're not so complicated yet. Right now, we're simply visualizing how the wagons in the tabernacle worked and how the Levium, when they would deconstruct the Mishkan, would pass the krashim from one wagon to the other, how they would not. And then this is extrapolated into a more conventional urban setup of 2 balconies facing each other versus being side by side, almost as if to say that it would be more problematic for me to pass something to the neighbor next to me than to throw it to the building across from me. That's what it sounds like at this point. With Hashem's help, we'll have a lot more discussion. And Bli Neder, yes, we'll use some diagrams to simplify the discussion. I want to wish everyone again Mazel Tov on the Siyum, on the conclusion of Perek Asiri. Thank you for being along for the ride, even when sometimes we temporarily have a little mess to clean up or some things that are a little bit ambiguous. With Hashem's help, next time we learn, we'll hopefully clarify the topic, and then we'll make it more complicated again in the Gemara. Be'ezer Hashem.
Schomberg having a class.
I don't believe Schomberg's having a class today. I think Sunday he's going to resume, but I don't believe he's doing a class today. Have a wonderful day. Thank you all. Have a wonderful Shabbos.
Good
And if you're
Shabbos.
having a little champagne, we'll say l'chaim for the conclusion of Perek Asiri of Masechet Shabbos. And again, we should all have all good fortune, good health, naches, gesund, and all good things. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. All the best.